LinkedIn News.
It's really critical for us to have a moment where we can really sit with the full extent of our lives. There is this actual practice in narrative-based psychotherapy that helps a person to rewrite their story. And when they can actually restructure their narrative and see the full breadth of everything that they are and everything that they can actually contribute to the world, it allows them an expansion beyond that negativistic view. So when we can actually shift and transition and globalize the view and really expand the view, it allows us an opportunity to reach more of that emotional balance because we're integrating more positive elements, or at least balanced elements of our lives into our understanding of ourselves, but not just that, also our understanding of other people and our understanding of the world. And what has happened to me doesn't need to dictate what the rest of my life can look like.
So that's Dr. Mariel Buqué. I'm Leah Smart, and this is Everyday Better. Make sure you hit that follow button to get new episodes of our podcasts every week. Our conversation starts in just a few moments. Hey everyone, from LinkedIn News, I'm Leah Smart, and this is Everyday Better, a self-improvement podcast where every week I sit down with some of the world's brightest minds and bravest hearts to learn how we can improve ourselves, our relationship to others, and the world around us. If you're not subscribed to my newsletter, make sure you sign up. You'll get weekly research-backed practices for elevating your mindset and living more meaningfully right into your inbox. Go to linkedin.com/everydaybetter. That's linkedin.com/everydaybetter. I would be honored to jump into your inbox and share strategies for choosing to be a little bit better every day. This week, to wrap up our Black voices who inspire excellence, I'm sitting down in the studio with Dr. Mariel Buqué. If you haven't heard of Dr. Mariel, she is a trauma psychologist, and her work today is largely focused on how we heal from intergenerational trauma. Now, before you decide if that applies to you or not, let's talk about what trauma actually is and who experiences it. Dr. Mariel shared with me that first, the World Health Organization did a survey and found that 70% of people say they have experienced some form of trauma. Now, there are big traumas. You can imagine these are things like going through a war, abuse, or abandonment. But then maybe more applicable are the little traumas or the little T's. This is things like bullying, rejection, being othered, or discrimination. And most of us have experienced little T's. And here's the thing, being exposed to them repeatedly can have a serious impact on you. When we are impacted, we move through the world differently. We may choose to do or not do things because of the fact that our past experiences still feel like they're with us and maybe even happening again when we don't realize it. The intergenerational part is that they've found that we do pass this trauma on to our descendants. So the reason I chose this conversation for the end of our series is that it is possible you or someone you know is not their best today because of a little T or a big T. And for those of us in marginalized groups of any kind, this is especially likely. I want all of us to be able to heal from it. So here's Dr. Mariel on breaking the cycle.
I believe that we are lifelong learners. Learning never stops. One of my clients was 84 years old, and I worked with that person for a few years. And so it made me also just understand the fact that we are never really exempt from learning. And in addition to that, just last year, I took 60 hours of trauma training. And I'm sitting here writing a book about trauma healing. The learning never ceases for me. So I always want to know more. I want to explore more. Right now, I'm diving into a lot of recent studies that have been done on generational healing that have been specifically tailored for specific racial ethnic populations. And I want to know more about the depths of what are we finding here? Mm-hmm. And then what can I do to then extract that information that's very dense and heavy and clinical and scientific and place it in the hands of a larger community? So having hundreds of thousands of people following me is an opportunity for expanded conversations, for me to really take everything that's locked up in these paywalls and ivory towers, mm-hmm. and to extract that information, make it digestible and tangible and accessible to people like my mom, to people like my sister, and then allow for there to be, as I call them, like liberatory tools, because once they're in the hands of people, then people can have power, they have emotional liberation, they have an opportunity to choose, there's agency, because I can choose to do something that can be better for my health because now I know better.
I'm going out of order here, and I do want to hear your journey, but I also want to acknowledge we're talking about this during Black History Month. And part of the reason I wanted you on this show during Black History Month is your work is so important and I think right now potent for how we heal trauma and how we recognize that it is passed down, that it is intergenerational, that there are things within us and me and you, differences because of the way that we grew up and where we lived and all these things. But there are things within us that are societal that may cause us to behave in certain ways or have certain experiences. One of the challenges that I think is changing, or definitely has changed, but is still so real, is growing up in the Black community. I can say, I don't remember ever hearing about therapy or talking to someone about what's been going on or recognition of what we had been through as Black people in America. I think that's shifted, but I do still think that's something that's difficult. And I think it spans other racial backgrounds, people of color. I'm sure it spans other ethnicities. What do you say to people who are like, this isn't a thing, this isn't real, just go out and live your life, figure it out? Because that's how I feel we've talked about it in our community.
Well, the thing about trauma within the Black community specifically is that it has become so much of the norm because it was perpetuated and continues to be for such a long time within racial caste systems, within racism from Jim Crow on, and even the caste systems that still persist, and the ways in which everyday discrimination is a part of the present day experience of anyone who walks around with Black skin. And all of that makes it so that trauma is so incredibly pertinent and present that it almost becomes the status quo. And it almost becomes invisible because if it's so much of the norm and it's hard to recognize and point out and say, actually, no, this is trauma or traumatizing. I know there's a lot of language that we have around experiences that hurt us, right? But I think we still are struggling to make a connection between the experiences that hurt us or the systems that hurt us and the fact that they leave behind trauma. That is what I'm hoping to expand as far as the conversation for us, because that word, I think, still holds entirely too much stigma in our communities. And I have had such a tough time being able to integrate that word into conversations with us. And I think it's in that point of acknowledgement. We have been traumatized. We are people that have experienced intergenerational trauma, meaning that the people that have been in our families have also been suffering for a very long time. As soon as we can actually get to that point of recognition, I think there's going to be a profound amount of healing. I call it step 0, actually. It's the step that you must take, acknowledgement, before you even get into the process of then integrating healing work into your life.
So intergenerational trauma, the acknowledgement of it is the acknowledgement that there have been systems or experiences, because I know you talk about people who come from families of abuse too. This all plays a role, that have happened, but it's the acknowledgement that they have left a mark that goes beyond the people who maybe experienced them in that moment. So I wasn't alive during Jim Crow, but I had family members who were, and I'm a descendant of those family members. And so intergenerational trauma is the recognition that those moments in history are impacting me right now.
That's correct. The intergenerational trauma is actually the only type of emotional trauma that's handed down our family lines. We actually inherit biological genetic markers that are reflective of the ways that our parents, our grandparents lived. And so if they lived lives that were marked by stress, marked by trauma, marked by segregation, then it made it so that this could have actually appeared in their genetic encoding. And upon conceiving us, they would have actually transferred over epigenetic markers, which are reflective of the ways in which their genes, in essence, took on their environment, the ways their genes reflected their environment. That would have transferred onto us in a specific way. We're still getting a sense of all the multitude of ways in which this gets passed on. But what we do know is that people who descend from people, parents, grandparents who themselves have had experiences of terror, prolonged experiences of terror specifically, that they actually resemble the biology of someone who has PTSD or someone who can be prone to it, which means that they have cortisol levels that are reflective of the possibility of PTSD or a propensity to it. And so all of that is telling us these people have an emotional vulnerability. They're perhaps more tender than someone who doesn't have that history. And so we have to take that into account when we look at someone and we see that perhaps they may be in a depressive state for 10, 15 years. And you look at them and you're like, why can't you get out of it? Why can't you not be depressed? And so we have to have an understanding of the fact that there are undercurrents of trauma that people have been carrying. And then their environment, anything can happen. They can get into a relationship that's unhealthy. Maybe they experience bullying in school or the workplace. Any of these things can actually trigger those emotional vulnerabilities and make it so that now they are experiencing trauma symptoms. And that is what makes it intergenerational, that their parents would have then transferred over that biological material that was reflective of the traumas they experienced. And now you, with your emotional vulnerabilities, suffered your own traumas or traumatic experiences. And you are also carrying those trauma responses. So now we have two generations that have trauma, meaning we have intergenerational trauma.
So what happens because we have these markers in us? What happens to our health? What happens to our experience of the world?
Well, what we know is that we actually hold greater vulnerabilities to not only mental, but physical illnesses. So any kind of studies or the news, like higher rates of depression among Black youth, that always sends me down the spiral of thoughts. What is it about this specific population? Of course, we have the environmental factors. The New York Times released a study that was done around targeted violence and like Black youth being the most prominent subset of society that actually was at the receiving end of targeted violence. And so it's important for us to hold in consideration the fact that the external factors are there, but the internal vulnerabilities are also there. So when we're in school systems as educators, when we're mental health clinicians, when we are community members that are taking care of these children, when we are actually in workplaces already being adults and have a colleague that we understand falls within these racial categories or other vulnerable categories, then it's going to be really critical for us to hold in consideration how we're orienting around these individuals to make sure that we're not creating greater triggers. But in addition to that, especially within the mental health field and especially within the health field as a global whole, we have to take into consideration the ways that stress and trauma metabolizes this physical illness too. The ways in which metabolic diseases and diabetes, hypertension, that these diseases have a direct correlate to stress. And the ways in which heart conditions that actually restructure the actual anatomy of the heart also correlates to stress. The ways in which autoimmune conditions tend to have a very, very high prominence in homes or in adults who come from homes where stress and trauma and chaos has been the norm. And so all of that needs to be a part of the general understanding that we have really as a society around the fact that people come into this world with specific vulnerabilities based on the histories that they come in with. And it can allow us to then start building policy, start building healthcare systems that are tailored towards trauma responsiveness, start building educational systems that have that understanding within them. And if we choose to actually make a shift, we can make really great shifts to adjust.
I'd assume you can answer this. We all have our own brand of trauma. So when I think about my brand of trauma, it's being Black in America. It's growing up in late 80s, early 90s in California. There's a very specific probably experience that I had that may be different from yours or others, but we're tied together in that way. And then we all have our own unique traumas on top of that. When I think about the complication of this and how deep this goes, I remember growing up, the Black kids at my school, and I went to public school, made fun of me. And I got bullied because I talked like this. This is how I talk. It's how my parents talked. But that wasn't acceptable. So that's burned into my brain of this odd feeling of not accepted in the group of people who look like you. I wanted to say that because I do think that there's so many people, especially people of color, where there is this experience of feeling sort of orphaned within your own ethnicity, within your own race. I'm calling that out to say, like, if anyone does feel that experience or know that, I'm sure you would say you're not alone, but I also want to say you're not alone. On top of that, I'm curious, where else do you see intergenerational trauma coming up for people so that people can understand, hey, it's not necessarily just a racial thing. There are other pieces of this that come into play.
Yeah, literally almost all of us have some element of trauma. Actually, the World Health Organization identified that about 70% of adults recorded that they have some sort of trauma or traumatic event that has occurred in their lives, with each of those having about 2 to 3 events happening just in the recent years. And I think that's underreported, especially post-pandemic, within all of the different ways in which globalization has actually reflected to us the ills of the world. I think that there's a lot that we're exposed to that can be fairly traumatic, and we're underappraising those. But to your point about that orphan feeling, that is a feeling that is prominent for a lot of folks too. But it is a very unique experience for the individuals that feel like they don't have a cultural home. And I have heard the terminology cultural homelessness being used in reference to that. Let's say like someone immigrated to the US, and by way of immigrating, now they lost a bit of the culture from back home, wherever that may be. And they've adopted certain ways of being because of their US socialization. When they go back home, people call them a name that implies that they're a foreigner.
Mm-hmm.
And so they no longer feel like they have that belongingness that they had at home. And when they come back to the US, they're still seen as a foreigner. So it's a sense of not feeling like they're from either place. I'm Afro-Latina, I'm Afro-Dominican, and the experience of being Afro-Latina definitely fits within that context too, because for some of my community members that are in the Black diaspora, I may not be seen as Black enough. For some of my community members that are in the Latina community, they say, oh, you're Latina? So they don't see me as one of them, some. And so I get that often enough that it it feels like, well, where do I belong? So I've had to really step into my own identity. And I think that a lot of us have to do that laborious work, that emotional work of really standing firm on who we are when we're getting this chronic invalidation from both sides. And that can feel very isolating. And as we know, that sense of isolation and loneliness is very deleterious to our mental health and to our physical health. It does impact us on a profound level and for a very long time. So it is a part of what I would certainly appraise as feeling traumatic. We actually have this term in trauma called traumatic invalidation. And so when you think about the fact that invalidation, and this is mostly within the context of, let's say, a parent that constantly invalidated you, you're not depressed, you're fine. If we just extract it and place it in the context of cultural homelessness, chronically feeling invalidated as not belonging in either group and really having to make your own path that feels very lonely, that is very traumatic. And a lot of us don't have the language for it, and we also don't have the spaces to actually speak to it. And some of us don't even want to because we want to belong. And for anyone listening, acknowledge that for you as well, because it hurts. It really does. And it stays with us. I am in my late 30s, and there are some times when I still deal with it. I think even more injurious about those things is that I love my communities so much. I do my work for my communities. I want to show up for us every single day. So when you get that, it's almost like, oh, come on, I'm working so hard for us. And then I feel like I'm getting the injury that I'm trying for us to not have.
Yes.
Which is like wild to think about. But that is the world that we exist in, and it's a part of how we need to collectively unlearn these ideas that continue to hurt us and break us apart so that we can have more cohesion.
How do we get out of that cycle of doing that to each other? I really do resonate with the moments of injury when you're like, man. And I also resonate with points for me, like I think I'm still working through that, where I may injure myself or close myself off because I make an assumption about what people will think of me. And so then I end up a little more in my own silo, not on purpose, but because I'm protecting myself. So it's all this cycle of how do we break out of this and how do we think differently or approach things differently. When you talk about this 70% of people who are reporting and maybe more who actually feel it, I mean, does it span the gamut? I've heard people talk about big T, little t. How do people experience trauma, and when does it happen? Is it just in our childhood? Is it in these crazy moments like COVID? Tell me about that.
Trauma is definitely an experience that doesn't really discriminate. So it really can happen at all points of our lives, and it can happen across cultural identities. The thing about the pandemic specifically is it forced us into having an understanding of how we feel at a deeper level than what we would have been accustomed to. We were forced into this experience of confronting everything that was relegated to the shadows because now we were in silence. Now we were having to be with family for extended periods of time beyond what would have been our norm. And that also brought up a lot of those intergenerational woes that have been there. But because we had the opportunity to escape or transition or go home or do whatever it is that we needed to do in order to not confront what was in front of us, that was no longer there, that barrier to our minds. We had to see what was truly there, which was a lot of pain for a lot of us, which is a part of why I believe we catapulted into a global mental health crisis, because all of us were literally in this shutdown space where we had to just be with ourselves.
Do you think because of social media, which I think does so much good, but one of the things that I think is challenging is I often hear people talk about trauma in like a flippant way or in a way that's like, oh, I'm traumatized by this. Tell me what trauma is not.
Trauma is not an event because we tend to believe that any old thing that happens that might be perceived as adversity is traumatic to every person, and it isn't. You mentioned big T and little t traumas, and even those big T's are considered like the kinds of traumas that may have threatened your sense of safety. Little T's are just everyday occurrences that could throw you off kilter, but don't necessarily threaten your personhood. Big T might be like a car accident or someone in your family being ill or you being ill and almost not making it. Little T is maybe like a relationship that ended and it was a relationship of 7 years, so you now have to go through the trauma of grief. So it's important for us to recognize also that someone could have a series of presumed to be small t traumas. And they could have these on a chronic scale. For example, they could suffer discrimination on an almost daily basis. Someone called them a racial slur on the train. And then they came into work and they got bypassed for a promotion. And then they went home, and as they were going into the grocery store, there was a microaggression there, right? There's so many things that happen throughout the day of someone that suffers through chronic traumas as they accumulate amount to what feels like a big T. So it's important for us to have that recognition. But what it is not is just an event. What it is our appraisal of that event. It's how we got through the event. It's how we coped through the event that is, in essence, experienced as trauma. And what I mean by that is that a trauma response is really a prolonged experience of feeling like you're in a state of threat, even after the threatening event has passed.
What is prolonged?
Prolonged in clinical terms is perceived to be anywhere from 2 weeks to 3 months is what we call like an acute period. And then it transitions into post-traumatic stress, anywhere from a month to 6 months or so. Then we usually start addressing the trauma there. And if we address the trauma and then see that there's perhaps other traumas that happened earlier, we start identifying them like childhood trauma, developmental trauma, and things like that. But when we're talking about something that happened in our adult lives and just happened 4 months ago, and you're still having that prolonged stress response, then it's considered to be post-traumatic stress.
Got it. I love your point about how trauma doesn't discriminate and that trauma is about how we appraise a situation. Two different people could go through the same experience, appraise it differently, and one could come out without PTSD and one could come out with.
Yeah, because we have to think about two individuals that, let's say, were both a part of the same car accident, but one individual would have actually had a tumultuous relationship just last year that they got out of. And before that, maybe they had a really rough childhood and they were filtered through the foster care system, didn't really have a lot of stability there, right? And so we have to think about this person's emotional capacities and the fact that because they're human, eventually their capacities are going to tap out. And whatever it is that was holding them together is going to eventually say, you know what, I kind of had enough. So I'm just going to be in survival mode just in case anything else wants to threaten our safety. Whereas the other person, they may have lived a life that was relatively easy, right? And they would have had perhaps a bit more to hold them steady to actually get through a circumstance like near death.
Is it fertile ground for trauma or is it not? Can be the
Yeah.
reason. Yeah.
Yeah. Always talk about trauma, the concept of resilience and building it, because we do have the capacity to actually build upon the resilience that we already have. Now, if we take into consideration that person that would have had that tumultuous past, that's a person that probably was pretty sturdy if they went through all of that and still made it into their adult lives, being able to remain well as they could, right? I think it's important for us to recognize that many of us have an untapped reservoir of resilience that is there and can actually be blossomed and burgeoned and built upon.
I love this point. I want to take us this way anyway toward like, what do we do to break the cycle? What does healing look like? But just the point that if you have experienced trauma, big T or little t, and you're still here and you're still functioning and you're still going forward, you probably are incredibly resilient. Is that what you're saying? Okay.
Absolutely.
Huge.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of people go, I've experienced trauma, and it's almost like we equate trauma with weakness.
Not at all. And also, some people that experience trauma become very centralized around their trauma narrative when that's just one part of who you are and where you've been. So it's really important for us to decontextualize trauma in our lives and to really see the big picture, like all of the human that you are, right? It's important for us to have a more global perspective of ourselves, which can actually help us to overcome certain experiences that wear us down.
One of the big things you talk about, and one of the things that I think was huge in the field of psychology and et cetera, is the body, trauma and the body. You talk about trauma and the nervous system, trauma and the inner child. I haven't been in a biology class in so long. Like, talk to me about what the nervous system is, does, and how trauma impacts it.
Yeah, our nervous system is a part of our body that is actually connected to just about everything. And it is mechanized, like it is actually structured to go through stressors and then come out of them and help you reach an actual emotional balance. So it's actually broken out into parts. There's what we call like the sympathetic response, and that is a part of our nervous system that prepares us to actually fend off any perceived threat. And it's very animalistic, very evolutionary, right? But it also helps us to just stay very alert. If anything is happening in our environment that can place us in danger, we actually start to develop specific automatic mechanisms to help us survive the moment. Our pupils dilate, our heart starts racing, just preparing us to like pump a lot of blood and like get us ready to fight. And we also have constriction that happens in certain areas of our bodies, like our cortical brain, so the brain region that we need for more advanced thinking and problem solving, that gets shut down just a bit because we don't need it for survival. We need the hindbrain or the other parts of our brain. And in addition to that, our gastro tract is also kind of shut down a little bit because we don't need to digest in that moment. What we need is survival yet again. So all of that happens and it prepares us for what we call fight or flight. So we're either going to fight off what we perceive to be the threat, or we're going to flee, we're going to run, we're going to save our lives, right? Now, when that happens for a prolonged period of time and it's unrelentless, when it's discrimination, when it's abuse, when it's you being in a relationship and the fights are daily, when it's a work environment where you're feeling unwell, you don't feel cared for, you don't feel psychologically safe. When it's prolonged, what tends to happen is that we go into the other part of our nervous system, which is called the dorsal vagal state. And in dorsal vagal, typically what tends to happen is that we either freeze or fawn. And freezing is basically what many people in essence call like dissociation or deer in headlights, not being present. Like, you tap a coworker and you're like, hey,
hello,
where
yeah.
where have you been? And they've been in protection mode, right? Now, the fawn response is the type of response that's most closely aligned with what we call like people pleasing, which is just you doing anything to just make the stressor go away. Just appeasing the other party or just like literally just going about life in a suppressed mode. And then we have the third part of our nervous system, which is the parasympathetic response. Now, the parasympathetic response is the part of our nervous system that actually helps us to rest and recover when we've actually experienced some sort of a threat. And what it helps us to do is to not enter that dorsal vagal state. So we see a threat, the threat goes away, we actually enter rest and recovery, we're back in a state of balance, which we call homeostasis. and everything is fine. However, if we are in a dorsal vagal state for a prolonged period of time, what tends to happen is that can become more of the default. So we become, in essence, frozen in that state. And we believe subconsciously that we're always going to experience some sort of a threat. And so our minds or thoughts start actually reflecting that. The words that come out of our mouths start reflecting this possibility that people don't like us, that we might be in danger, or that somebody is trying to do something to us, or that a system is actually against us. And a lot of these things can be corroborated, so they are actually true. But the thing is that now our nervous system has defaulted to that state as well. So our nervous system is no longer fighting, no longer fleeing. It's simply just being in this shutdown mode.
How do we get out of that?
Yeah, that is a really, really important question, because right now, the way that our nervous systems are structured in this present society, and even just being in that constant feeling like something can happen, even if you're not in shutdown mode, it's going to be really critical for us to actually engage in lifestyle changes. I don't believe that us doing a yoga class on Saturday is actually going to do what we need it to do for us to actually not feel like we're in constant threat anymore.
So commercial self-care is not going to work for this.
It's not.
Got it.
It's not. We're going to need ongoing, daily, accessible practices that can actually help to soothe and restore our nervous system each and every day. And that's a big reason why a lot of the practices that I engage in and that I promote tend to be accessible. They tend to be the kinds of practices that if you're going from one meeting to the next and there's a 5-minute gap between those meetings, you can actually do the practice then. When you wake up in the morning, when you go to sleep at night, you can take those 3 extra minutes to do the practices. And in all of these moments, you're not just helping your nervous system to relax right then. You're also helping your nervous system to develop new neural pathways that connect to that relaxation practice. So it's a more long-term experience that you're also developing for yourself, and even structurally within your brain and within your nervous system. Not just that your mind is shifting, it's that you're actually changing your body.
I think self-care has been commercialized. And I love yoga too, but we're talking about something different. When we think about these practices for a person who has not touched psychology, has not touched biology, does not know anything about this, but is trying to understand, I want to back it up a sec and say, it sounds like what you're saying is, number one, we are wired to survive. Number two, our bodies have experiences that tell our bodies, you're either okay or you're not okay. And then our bodies respond. And depending upon how long this goes, we can put our bodies and minds into a place of consistently feeling like we're not okay. And so then in order to come out of that consistent experience of not okayness, these practices rewire us so that our bodies eventually automatically respond.
That's correct. And science is still trying to get a sense of how many repetitions we need in order to build the body memory that actually remembers on its own and by default, we are well, we are rested, we are relaxed, or that actually remembers we can do this to actually feel well versus going deep into crisis. And right now, at the very least, we are looking at 30 to 40 repetitions, which isn't a lot. If you think of a month and a half of actually devoting yourself to a practice of 5 minutes a day, of deep breathing, of really sitting in a space where there's silence, where there's you, where there's a relationship that you can have with yourself and with your breath, it can have a monumental effect on your overall well-being, physical and mental. But for prolonged and steady and long-lasting body memory to really center itself as the default, we're looking at somewhere along the lines of 300 to 400 repetitions. Which, of
That's
course,
where it gets serious.
I mean, it sounds like a lot still, but I also like to contextualize it within time and say, listen, it's a year of your life, 365 days. That's kind of in the middle, right? And if you think about it in this way, like if you've been suffering for decades, being able to devote that year of your life to actually giving yourself those 5 minutes and restructuring the ways in which your nervous system has been in default threat mode and actually defaulting it more to relaxation, it feels like it's worth it, so that the next 20, 30, 40 years can actually be reflective of the work that you did in this year.
Is it also then so that we don't pass it down?
Yeah. You're also working with your body in order to help your body absorb stress better for the long term, which means that the ways in which your body epigenetically has been framed and structured is also going to be changing, because a part of your social environment or what you're introducing to your body is more longstanding relaxation. So of course, just as much as trauma can be embedded in the genetic encoding, so can the relaxation that you produce. So can those new neural connections that then transform into cellular memory. And cellular memory is also something that can be passed down, right? And so like all of that needs to be taken into consideration. Yet again, not just when, we're working with people from a therapeutic lens, but also when we're working with kids and we're in the classrooms and administrators are thinking about the possibilities of integrating mindfulness practices into the classroom, right? The same goes for like mindfulness at work and how incredibly useful and helpful it can be in helping workers establish psychological safety to be able to actually utilize more of that cortical brain. The prefrontal cortex is going to be so incredibly important to actually producing good work and work that mirrors their capacities, right? Like there's so many benefits. When I talk about these things, especially when I started maybe like 10 years ago, I felt like I was talking about stuff that people were like, I don't know what you're saying here.
Yeah.
And now I think that people are a little bit more receptive because we're very science-driven. So if it helps, the science is there.
All right, we're taking a quick break. Take a deep breath. We'll be right back with Dr. Mariel Buqué. And we're back with Dr. Mariel Buqué. What happens on the other side of all this? Like you started with, you've done 10 years of this work. You talk about liberation and you talk about doing this with your family. When someone hears 300 to 400 reps, if someone's feeling like, wow, a year is a long time, how am I going to remember? How am I going to do it? Do I have time? I'm too busy. I think what can support people in this is that we're talking about a carrot versus a stick. So what is the feeling and the experience of coming out on the other side and saying, I've addressed this in such a way that my body and my brain are able to function in a way that allows me to be my best?
I think that the other side looks like pride, because the side that has been in that process of the emotional weight usually carries heavy emotions with it: shame, guilt, sadness, and we tend to stew in that for a very long time, and it can get even heavier and compounded. The other side of that is, wow, I did that.
Yeah.
I unclenched my jaw by default. My shoulders just rolled down, and I felt more steady in that meeting than I would have maybe a year ago. I felt like my voice didn't quiver when I spoke about something that would have been really difficult to talk about a year and a half ago. And I can stand in my truth, and this feels good. I feel like a different person. Those are the things that we can look forward to. My relationships are better because I am a reflection of those relationships, and I feel better. So I'm showing up to those relationships with a steadier mind, with a little bit more of a pocket of time to actually reflect on what my next move is going to be. And if that move, right? That's the gift that I say we tend to gain with these practices, where instead of being reactionary and just going off that threat response, I'm buying myself 2 to 3 seconds to think, wait a second, actually, that may just be coming from an internal place. This person actually doesn't mean me like any ill, and I can actually respond from a different place now. So there are gifts that are there that are waiting for us.
You talked earlier about something that I think is really interesting, and I wonder if you can tie this up with the other side of working through our trauma, which is our narratives. You said that oftentimes trauma can kind of play the main character in the narrative of our individual lives or even in collective societies too. What does it look like to, I think you used the term globalize, what does it look like to globalize our narratives so that trauma has its rightful, appropriate, and honored place without it getting in the way of us approaching our lives the way we want to?
It's really critical for us to have a moment where we can really sit with the full extent of our lives. There is this actual practice in narrative-based psychotherapy that helps a person to rewrite their story. And it's a beautiful practice because very often people are also able to see how much their story was marked by grief and shame and sadness and all the things that were so prominent inside of their minds that they would gravitate to those things so often and actually feed the sadness and feed the anxiety and feed the shame. And when they can actually restructure their narrative and see the full breadth of everything that they are and everything that they can actually contribute to the world, it allows them an expansion beyond that negativistic view. And the thing about trauma is that it does default us to pessimism because we tend to think that there's something bad that's going to happen at all times. So of course you're going to be pessimistic. The language that you use is going to be pessimistic, but really it's just protective language. If you can say something bad is going to happen, you can almost protect yourself or believe that you can protect yourself from it happening. So when we can actually shift and transition and globalize the view and really expand the view, it allows us an opportunity to reach more of that emotional balance because we're integrating more positive elements, or at least like balanced elements of our lives into our understanding of ourselves, but not just that, also our understanding of other people and our understanding of the world. Because when we expand our view to be more balanced, it actually translates into how we interact with others and how we see others, but also how we see the entire world.
So the case for someone to even consider doing work like this is obviously the pride and the gifts of just what it's like to be in your own body, in your own skin, and the shift that can come from that. I heard you say also, and I really loved this in a different interview, that part of this work is recognizing that it does get better, that there is another side to this. There's a tunnel and a path through where you'll look back and go, oh, I remember that time. And not that it will all be perfect. And you talked about perfectionism in one of the conversations, that it's not that it gets perfect and you're perfectly healed and there's a bow on that moment and now life is great, but that it will improve. So I think that's really powerful. But then the other piece, when we talk about how we interact with the people around us, the other case for this is you're going to show up better, which means hopefully it rubs off on other people and they show up better, which can mean better relationships. But it's also that when you talk about pessimism, and I'm like, oh my gosh, yes, that resonates, that we'll look at the world with a different set of eyes that are realistic, but not necessarily with the pessimistic set of glasses on.
Yeah, because that pessimistic set of glasses can actually contribute to the spiraling. And at that point in time, the reasons why the pessimism came into place may not have been your fault.
Mm-hmm.
There may have been social factors, environmental factors, and systemic factors, and even interpersonal factors that actually contributed to that pessimism. Very valid, very understandable. What you do from there on out is within your control and a choice. And so you can take them off. And maybe you'll need to put them on here and there, right? That may be still a part of the coping that you need to sustain until you've developed mastery over another coping mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
But it is critical for, even as you're putting them on and off, to have conscious awareness of this is a choice. And what has happened to me doesn't need to dictate what the rest of my life can look like.
You've talked about doing this work for a decade. When you look at the work you've done here, what are you celebrating?
Oh, wow. I'm celebrating especially the people that are the unconventional healers, like the people that I wasn't expecting to see on my book talks. The older generations, especially, that were coming in and saying, it's been 6 decades of this, and I think I've actually even perpetuated harm onto the people around me, my children. I want to change, and I'd like a different life for them. Is it too late, or can I do this? Those have been some of the most heartwarming moments because it also gives me a lot of hope that this work can be applicable to anyone and that people really do want to change. They just need the tools.
Oof. And do you have a moment where you're like, I looked out into the crowd and I saw someone and went, wait, what? Like
Yeah.
the record stopped?
Yeah.
Wow.
And, I've had actually a few people that have posed questions in a crowd. So that also speaks to the level of destigmatization that's happening in these conversations around this book, where people are having the courage to say, listen, I've erred, I see it. Listening to you speak and listening to what intergenerational trauma is, I can see how it's played a role in my life and in my relationships. How can I shift? How can I change? What is it that I need to do starting today? I think that that's what really cemented for me the fact that this book has a real place in the world and that
Yes.
these tools have a real place.
I want to make one note too that if you haven't yet gone on the therapy journey or thought about this at all, one of the things that can come up is blame of the people who are your ancestors or the people that you've known or the people who raised you, because you can feel like, oh, it was their fault or they could have done better and now I have to do it. Can you talk to that quickly?
I think that I can understand why we would want to place blame somewhere because we want to discharge that energy. We don't want to hold on to it. But we have to take into consideration, when was the first time when emotional trauma as language actually entered your vocabulary? And that's likely to be just a few years, which means that for older generations, they didn't have that language. They didn't have accessibility to the tools that we have in this very modernized age where we can turn on our phones and we have immediate access to so much information that can actually help us through a moment almost instantaneously. They didn't have that. They had the coping mechanisms that were available to them. And a lot of that was actually avoidance in older generations, like just suppress it, everything's fine. And so when we think about the fact that I call this intergenerational privilege, we have the intergenerational privilege of information that is accessible and information to healing and healing tools and the internet. I'm not saying go on the internet and find your healing, but I am saying that you can open a book like this one and say, there's tools here. There are professionals that are actually creating tools that are accessible for everyone, for all of us, and they didn't have that. And so my hope is that we can at least hold on to that truth, because in there's a lot of compassion that we can have for the people that didn't get a chance to and didn't have access to the tools that we have today.
And that's part of breaking the cycle. That is breaking the cycle.
Absolutely. We're not going to be able to fully, wholeheartedly forgive everything that everyone has done, right? That's unrealistic. It is essential for us to, at the very least, consider that we come from people who themselves have suffered, who themselves have had wounds that they've carried since they were kids. And they've had to find a way to survive. And it can be really hard to see a person in survival mode for decades. That's really gut-wrenching. And when you think about a parent in that way, it offers you an opportunity to think, okay, wow, like my parent, they went through 71 years of having to have a survival mode that didn't really serve them and actually made them even more unwell and distanced them from having a better relationship, even with their kids, even with me. That sucks. And I wish they could have had better. But you know what? I have the tools. I can do better. I can be better. And maybe I'll do this also in honor of them and the ways that they couldn't heal.
Yeah, it's like, and I will. I'll choose. So you talked about choice. I will choose to do this. Okay, so what are your top exercises that we can do, whether we're laying in bed, sitting at home quietly, we're at the coffee shop, we're at lunch because we're working, we're sitting with a group of people and we're feeling something come on. What can we do to address this and that can allow us to get these 300 to 400 reps in?
I really love to gravitate towards what can actually be helpful to our nervous system specifically, right? We can, of course, journal. We can make sure that we stay close to community and people that really see us and understand us. Those are imperative, and I don't want to miss them. But the three that I like to focus on, which are very nervous system focused and are the ones that I said are accessible literally all the time to all of us, are breathing, humming, and rocking. And they're my favorite, in part because they're also tools that you can use anywhere. I might have someone cut me off at the grocery store and be so livid at how rude they would have been. And I go in my car and I take those deep breaths and I rock for a couple minutes and I just allow myself an opportunity to just bring my nervous system back into a state where I desire it to be, because I desire it to be well. So humming as a starter is really just humming a song. Instead of singing it, you might pop on like a song on the radio, and instead of singing it, hum it. And it already is a way in which your ventral vagal nerve, or the nerve that's really elicited in that parasympathetic response and that relaxation response from your nervous system, it's actually triggered. And it allows you to feel more at ease in the moment. But remember, we're also talking long-term. So it also has that long-term element. The same for rocking. Rocking creates a ventral vagal response as well. So you can rock and sway from side to side. Sometimes you can do that in your office chair. No one will even know
Yeah,
that
what do
you're
you mean
like,
by rocking? It's
yeah,
just literally
yeah,
like
like
moving your body from.
moving side to
Oh,
side. You
wow.
can
Okay.
rock front to back. Really, whatever feels comfortable to you. And you can just do that while you're typing or you're watching like a training video and you're just rocking. And it also stimulates the ventral vagal nerve. And it's an easy practice that if you have mobility, you have the opportunity to rock. And then the big one, the big kahuna is always deep breathing, right? Even when people are having panic attacks, deep breathing is known to actually help to subside the panic attack because your body cannot be in a relaxation response and in a threat response simultaneously. So one supersedes the other, and typically deep breathing supersedes the panic. So whenever, someone might say something, maybe in a meeting, you have an opportunity to actually go into your body and take those deep breaths. And the beautiful thing about deep breathing, unlike humming and unlike rocking, is you can do it very silently and without anyone noticing. And it offers you an opportunity to that threat response that's about to come up, that's going to kick you into fight or flight. And you might say something that's not very kind, or you might walk out of that meeting and just cause a commotion. Instead, you can actually relax your body and mind, and then you're going to have greater access to problem solving, greater access to being able to say something that can actually forge connection between yourself and your colleagues, or yourself and your partner, and yourself and your kids, right? There's so many benefits of in the moment bringing in that relaxation response, but also for the long term, because even in the relationship realm, once you forge deeper connections instead of doing something that could be relationship destroying, that too has a long-term effect.
So, okay, the humming and the rocking are interesting to me because they feel innate. Like I think of humming with kids and the way we might hum to a child. The rocking, the way we might rock a child, or that we have rocking chairs. The breathing, do you have a specific one you recommend? I know the psychological sigh is going around right now, and then there's 478 and there's box breathing. Does it matter?
I lean on box breathing because of how easy it is. If someone who really needs a lot of stimulation and they may be in that meeting and they can't leave, they can doodle onto a paper, a square or a box, and they can actually breathe to the square. Or they can use their own finger and just do a box, like mapping a box to the table. And the way that I would practice with clients, I would actually use the 5-7 method. So I would in for 5 and 7 for the release, because I would see the gradual release of tension that would happen right in my very eyes when we actually resorted to that method. I like the idea of practices that can be multi-stimulating. So it's stimulating to the eyes because you already are in that deep focus of creating that box and actually going over it time and again. And then also you're focused on your breath. And so whatever it is that is permeating through your mind that is causing that upset doesn't have a lot of energy to actually stay there because you're so focused on the practice itself.
Got it. What I really value about the way that you're doing this work and putting this out there is you're putting it into the hands of people who want change. And I always believe that any system you're a part of will not change as fast as you can. And so real empowerment comes from deciding, I'm going to make the change. And it's going to be freaking hard. And it might suck for a period, but it will get better. That is where I feel like this pride and the gifts that we have can really show us how powerful we are. So I just so appreciate that the work you're doing is giving individuals the power they need to walk out into the world and say, this is my life, this is how I'm going to live it, and I'm willing to do this work so that I can, and so that I can make it better for people who come after me, whether I choose to have children or not. Even being able to walk into a school environment and show children, this is how you can live, is so freaking powerful for our society. So thank you for what you're doing. I'm going to have you complete these 3 statements, and then we're going to schedule time for you to come back.
Yes.
Better humans are.
Humans that are willing to do the daily work to be resilient and show others how to be more resilient.
Better work is.
Better work is a work environment that offers a space for rest and restoration, especially if stress is a part of the work environment.
Which I think almost all of us have that experience. And a better world has.
A better world has a specific ideology that's shared among everyone that is trauma responsive, trauma informed, and trauma conscious.
Thank you, Dr. Mariel. This was incredible.
Thank you for that.
Yeah,
Thank you
of
for
course.
having me. It's been so wonderful.
That was Dr. Mariel Buqué, author of Break the Cycle and pioneer in healing intergenerational trauma. You can pick up her book wherever you want to buy them. And I want to just say this is a big, sometimes heavy topic, but I hope this conversation gave you some new ways to think about how your past experiences have affected you or are affecting you today, along with a little more clarity and practices for healing. If you feel like this is something you need to explore more, I would highly encourage you to do it with a professional who's able to help support you through this. There is absolutely nothing wrong with that, and I will say I have greatly benefited from doing it. Personally, when it comes to Dr. Mariel's techniques, I've been trying out her 5-7 breath, which I love, and I really do notice a difference in the moment. And I try to hum when I remember to and when I'm feeling a little bit anxious. Next week, we'll be kicking off Women's History Month by featuring exceptional women who are introducing new ways of thinking. I can't wait for you to join us and hear some of these incredible, incredible women. If this conversation resonated with you, share it with the first person who comes to mind. You never know how it could help them out. And support other people like you in finding our show by leaving us a rating before you go. Additionally, we'd love to hear what you liked about this episode or our show in general. So take a minute to write a 1-sentence review so that we can see it and thank you for it. If you're not subscribed to my newsletter, make sure you sign up. You'll get weekly research-backed practices for elevating your mindset and living more meaningfully right into your inbox. Go to linkedin.com/everydaybetter. That's linkedin.com/everydaybetter. Everyday Better is a production of LinkedIn News. The show is produced by Alexis Ramdow. Asaf Gujron is our sound engineer. He makes sure we sound good in the studio. Joe DeGiorgi mixed our show. Enrique Montalvo is the executive producer of LinkedIn Editorial Productions. Dave Pond is head of news production. Courtney Koop is head of LinkedIn Original Audio and Video. Dan Roth is the editor-in-chief of LinkedIn. And I'm Leah Smart. Thanks for coming with me, and I'll see you next week.